the great learning. Oh, okay. We have one announcement made first.
In one of his lectures recently, Professor Weiming mentioned a scholar by the name of Thomas Berry, who is very well known for his studies of the early Confucian tradition. And as it so happens, Professor Berry is going to be giving a talk a week from today called The Fate of the Earth or Human Responsibility. That's Thursday, April 11th, 5 o'clock in the Sperry Room, Andover Hall of the Divinity School. So if you're interested, I think you would find it quite interesting.
In the opening statement of the Great Learning, the Great Learning is perhaps the shortest classic in the Confucian tradition. The ancients who wish to illuminating virtue all under heaven, first govern their states. Wishing to govern their states, they first regulated their families. Wishing to regulate their families, they first cultivated their personal lives. Wishing to cultivate their personal lives, they first rectified their hearts and minds. Wishing to rectify their hearts and minds, they first authenticated their intentions, or making their will sincere. Wishing to authenticate their intentions, they first refined their knowledge. The refinement of knowledge laid in the study of things. For only when things are studied is knowledge refined. Only when knowledge is refined are intentions authentic. Only when intentions are authentic are hearts and minds rectified. Only when hearts and minds are rectified are personal lives cultivated. Only when personal lives are cultivated are families regulated. Only when families are regulated are states governed. Only when states are governed is there peace all under heaven. Therefore, from the Son of Heaven to the common people, all, without exception, must take self-cultivation as the root. The talk this morning is to investigate the basic precept in the Great Learning, the principle of the investigation of things. It's also rendered, I'm not to go into the more refined interpretive issues, as the rectification of affairs. The Great Learning is actually a chapter from one of the 5 books, 5 classics, the Book of Rites. Together with the doctrine of the mean, another chapter in the Book of Rites with the Analects and Mencius, Zhu Xi grouped them together to form the core curriculum of Neo-Confucian learning, the so-called 4 books. And the Great Learning could be considered as the core of the core curriculum. It's the first text that everyone is supposed to read, to understand, to memorize, to recite. In fact, prior to the impact of the West in the mid-19th century, all educated persons in East Asia, China, Korea, Japan, Vietnam, memorized this text as part of their mental furniture. They very much internalized the overall structure of the text. Zhu Xi considered this text particularly important. I mentioned last time in Zhu Xi's difficult task of trying to interpret the Confucian tradition, his commentaries, continuous commentaries on the Great Learning, symbolized this incessant effort to try to understand the Great Learning as a way of developing a coherent vision of the Confucian ethics. It's noted in Zhu Xi's biography that he continued to work on this particular text in terms of commentary ever since he was in his late 30s and early 40s. He died at the age of 70. Every day, in some way, he was confronted with this text. Even 3 days before he died, he made some changes. 3 characters he changed. So you can even conceptualize his major effort as a continuous wrestling with some of the basic ideas in this text and in this particular text. And he considered as a very difficult task for his hermeneutic work. And this particular text is actually devoted to leadership training, different from the elementary education. We call it the discipline of the body. And this is basically a holistic vision of the way of learning to be fully human. Even though it's a text for leadership training, it is not necessarily elitist. It is an invitation, a text that invites all members of the community to come together. That's why the very last line, from the Son of Heaven to the common people, all, without exception, must take self-cultivation as the root. It's a text that puts a great deal of emphasis on virtue-centered style of moral reasoning. Virtue-centered rather than rules-centered. At the same time, it's a style of moral reasoning that puts emphasis on the gradual process from the regulation, cultivation of one's own heart and mind as a basis for leadership, gradually extending to the family, to the community, to the state, and to the world beyond. Underlying this text is precisely the issues that I raised last time: mind, human nature, feelings. The mind, from Zhu Xi's point of view, combines human nature and feelings. The mind, or the heart and mind, is made of qi, the vital energy. The heart and mind of the human is the most refined manifestation of the vital energy in the world. Everything is made of vital energy, as we noted earlier. And in this particular configuration of the vital energy of the heart and mind, it consists of human nature on the one hand and human feelings on the other. Nature is related to the principle or the inner pattern. And feeling is, of course, another modality of the vital energy. The assumption is that the capacity of the human heart and mind is so embracive, so all-encompassing, that all the principles, and including, of course, the heavenly principle, all the principles are intrinsically inherent, intrinsically embodied in the capacity of the heart and mind of every human being, from the Son of Heaven to the commoners. The great learning then manifests itself in 3 particular modes. First, it is relevant not only to the leader, to the ruler, but to everybody. It is a way of trying to illuminate the illuminating virtue in each one of us, or to enlighten the enlightening virtue in each one of us. The enlightening virtue, of course, refers to our own human nature. And as Mencius pointed out, the reason that we can become fully human through our own self-effort is because our heart and mind is capable of not only feeling, willing, but also knowing and sensing. So these qualities are inherent in the heart and mind. The basic feelings, such as commiseration, deference, knowing right and wrong, and also the feeling of shame and dislike. These feelings are the basis of cardinal virtues such as humanity, rightness, wisdom, and propriety. So inherent in the heart and mind of each person these roots of the moral virtues are already implanted. That's our enlightening virtue. Yet the enlightening virtue inherent in our heart and mind is only the beginning. So we need to cultivate it. We need to allow that beginning to flourish. That's our human project. But in terms of leadership training, it is not only enough for us to cultivate ourselves, to allow the basic virtues to flourish in us. We need to try to renew the people around us as well. In other words, in order to establish ourselves, we help others to establish themselves. In order to enlarge ourselves, we help others to enlarge themselves. The person is not an island, but as essential relationships. At the same time, there is an idealism, not only in terms of the rulership, but in terms of every human being, to try to reach the highest goal. The ultimate concern is being able to reach the highest goal of human self-perfection. So in the very beginning of the structure of the Great Learning, the psychological issues of the cultivation of the person, the sociological issues of being concerned with the well-being of the society as a whole, and even the religious issue of the ultimate concern of human flourishing are singled out as three dimensions of this Confucian learning, which is psychological, sociological, and religious at the same time. But the particular stage, the particular procedure that is introduced is a procedure very much linked to self-cultivation. The cultivation of each and every person, no matter at what stage of human flourishing or at what particular position in terms of social worth. The assumption is that if we have a general direction, our aim is full human flourishing, not simply just to exist, to survive, but to develop ourselves as true sort of filial children of the cosmos. If that's the goal, it's a kind of moral idealism. If we have the highest goal is not abstract. The highest goal is to provide a general direction for our life. Now, if there is this highest goal to be able to reach the highest manifestation of humanity, then if we have this general direction, then there's firmness of purpose, not just individually, but collectively or communally. The firmness of purpose provides the possibility for us to overcome the restlessness of our heart and mind. The assumption is the heart and mind is always in the state of fluidity, in the state of change, in the state of transformation, unlike our body. The heart and mind has to be disciplined. So if we have a goal, we have a general direction, which is even the highest moral ideal, then we can help our heart and mind to become tranquil. If we have a firmness of purpose, our heart and mind will become tranquil, rather than being always in a state of restlessness. This tranquility of the heart and mind will provide a kind of peaceful repose. We become more relaxed. If our heart and mind is at a very calm stage, we become more relaxed, and we have a sense of comfort. The sense of comfort is that we have a sense of niche, no matter where we go. In terms of the whole human species, the argument is that we are here for a purpose. There's meaning in life. For individual persons, each one of us can have a sense of not only direction, but a sense of peaceful repose. And that will provide the basis for deep thinking, cogitation or deliberation. If our heart and mind is not at rest, it's always like a restless landscape. It's difficult for us to think deeply and to cogitate. It's a form of deep deliberation, deep thinking. If we can think deeply, then we'll be able to acquire the virtue, to acquire something, a virtue, that is internally situated in our own human nature. Now, the paradox is we have it, and yet we have to cultivate it to allow it to flourish. If we just take it for granted that we have it, it's like our heart and mind will eventually be lost. So Mencius said, learning consists of none other than to search for the lost heart. Often our heart is lost. Even though we go through the motion of doing things, we are not constantly alert, and our life is not being examined. So in this case, the 5 stages are deepening, we can call it a deepening self-understanding. It's a gradual process of self-understanding. Have a general direction of what we want to do, to have the peaceful mind, to reflect upon it, to have a sense of home, a sense of peaceful repose, and to be able to engage ourselves in deep thinking, to think the deep thoughts in the process of cogitation. And eventually we'll be able to take charge of our own heart and mind. The great learning then divides the total process of learning to be human in terms of the internal dimension and the external dimension. The external dimension is to extend the person to the family, individual person to the family, you can say community as well, to the state and all over the world. And the internal dimension, there are 5 internal dimensions, is the cultivation of the person is predicated on the rectification of the heart and mind, and that is predicated on the authentication of the will or intentions. That is predicated on the extension of knowledge or the refinement of knowledge, and that in itself is predicated on the investigation of things. So the investigation of things, in this sense, is the point of departure, the first step for us to learn to be fully human. And in order to truly investigate things, including our own body, our own mind, our own soul, our own spirit, we need to first make the clear distinction between the true self and the false self. In Neo-Confucian terminology, the distinction between the heavenly principle and human desires. And you can use the Mencius idea, the great body and the small body. The great body is the heavenly principle. The small body, our instinctual demands, our desires, we share with other members of the animal kingdom, constitute our small body. That's our selfish desires. In this sense, the Confucian project is very different from the Buddhist idea of trying to be selfless, to overcome oneself, to lose oneself, to become totally selfless. The Confucian idea is to find the true self, believing there is a true self to be found. And the true self is our own nature, is our human nature. And our own human nature is informed by the principle, which means informed by the inner pattern, and which is conferred by heaven. And in fact, we can even say the nature itself often reveals itself in terms of the basic natural feelings of our heart and mind. One of the most important feelings, of course, is the feeling of commiseration. And that feeling of commiseration becomes the basis for humanity and other virtues. And that which is uniquely ours as human beings is also the manifestation of the heavenly principle. So truly human in this sense, truly ourself, is not only compatible with the true nature of our heart and mind, or the true expressions of the basic feelings of heart and mind, but it's even compatible with the heavenly principle. So you can imagine these different terms refer from different dimensions, maybe different degrees of the same reality. The heavenly principle is inherent in our nature. Our nature expresses itself in terms of our heart and mind. One of the basic feelings of our heart and mind is commiseration. If we develop our sense of commiseration, we actually is developing our great body, because we'll be able to communicate not only with other human beings, but also with heaven. So this circular of heavenly principle, true human nature, true expressions of the feelings of the heart and mind, this particular line is sharply contrasted with selfish desires, privatized self, the false self, rather than the true self. The second principle that need to be clearly observed is to ask the fundamental questions whether we do something in the cultivation of ourselves for an external purpose and as an end, or as an end in itself. In other words, the distinction between rightness and profit. The Confucians are not against profit-taking, not against efficaciousness in social work, because they're very much engaged in the world here and now. But here, the emphasis is on the purity of motivation. The development of oneself, learning for the sake of the self, the development of oneself predicated on the purity of motivation. If we try to develop ourselves for the purpose of something externally defined, even though we may be able to do it very well, there's something fundamentally wrong here. We'll suffer. The cost eventually would be too high. In other words, the question is a sense of priority. If we try to develop ourselves for the sake of our own moral nature, it is not an economic calculation of benefit. If the economic calculation of benefit enters into our conceptualization of this at this juncture, it turned out to be disastrous. The reason is we'll be overcome by our selfish desires, by our small body, limited understanding of who we are, without knowing there is a much greater project involved. The idea is that the leaders, in order to lead, must be able to inspire others. The inspiration that the leader is able to exemplify is always an ideal. It's not simply the economic calculation or the distribution of power and wealth. Principle, in this sense, inherent in things or inherent in our nature, that's our true self, can never be obtained, can never be understood simply by an economic calculus or by what some scholars call instrumental rationality. The rationality that is based upon a calculation of the means and end, what I can get out of this in terms of my power, my influence, or even my reputation. On the surface, there's nothing wrong with that, right? If I work hard, I should gain the kind of economic benefit, the political power, and the social reputation that I fully deserve. There's nothing wrong with that. However, there's something very basically wrong from the Confucian point of view. It's because the purity of motivation, which is based upon my sense of what I ought to become as a person, rather than as an instrument for some kind of social utility, or as a reflection of some other people's ideas. It's not for myself. So that sense of what is really for myself, for human flourishing, the Greeks and the Confucians are very, very serious about this idea, the purity of motivation. Now, give you one example. If you want to become a great scientist, in the scientific community, this is a major assumption. You have to cultivate the spirit of disinterestedness, not uninterested. Sometimes we confuse these two terms. Uninterested, I'm not interested in. Disinterested is that I do it not because of some kind of economic calculus. I do it because intrinsic in doing it, there's some kind of value. You can never become a great scientist or a great musician or a great writer or a great philosopher, by implication, a great human being, if you do not have this commitment to something as an end in itself, rather than as simply a means to an end. The spirit of disinterestedness, not that you're not interested, you're intensely interested, you work very hard, but you don't do it simply because it will give you some kind of benefit external to the task. So if you say, I want to become a great pianist, the reason I want to become a great pianist is because if I become a virtuoso, I'll get all the benefit, all the applause and so forth. That motivation itself from this particular line of thinking may turn out to be extremely disorienting and eventually will be a major cost. And that cost you cannot really afford if your real intention is to excel either in a special profession or in a special art. So the spirit of disinterestedness is related to the idea of impartiality. You have to be able to be broad-minded, impartial, rather than being simply engaged in certain kind of private or personal pursuit. Now, in the Confucian context, the relationship between impartiality and partiality, or the public and private, can be a dialectic, a very complicated dialectic relationship. Yourself vis-a-vis the family can be the private, and the family will be the public domain. So to overcome yourself and to establish meaningful relationships with members of the family may be to move from the private to the public. The family vis-a-vis the community can be the private, and the community will be the public. And the community can be the private, the state or the country as a whole can be public. The country can be private. The international community can be public. And eventually, of course, human species can be private. The cosmos could be considered public. So the cultivation of the self in this connection is to move from the private to the public without losing sight of your own rootedness. When I sacrifice myself for some purpose in order to help my family members, it doesn't mean that I don't try to understand my true self. I'm not rooted in my own body, in my own mind. I'm not leaving myself. If I extend my sensitivity to the neighborhood, to the community, it doesn't mean that my love and care for my family is being totally overcome. So the interplay between the two, the private and the public, becomes critical. So principle, in this sense, is always public. You may feel it very strongly personally, but it has to be publicly demonstrable. So principle is public principle, principle is heavenly principle, principle is often in conflict with the idea of selfish desires, privatized selfish desires. And I don't have to repeat an earlier statement that good, to be good in the Confucian sense then, is to be open, to be involved in the dynamic process of transformation, and to be in the process of continuous development and growing. Flourishing, to be able to flourish, that's good. Evil means to be closed, to become static, to be overcome by one's inertia, especially the habits of the heart that are not able to, not the good habits, but the bad habits that constrain us to become highly privatized with a tremendous inertia, limitation, and also self-deception. Self-deception is always understood in terms of our inability to understand the true self as open, dynamic, transformative, and to be overcome by the selfish desires of the false self or the small body, which makes us small by closing us into the privacy of our own domain. And these forces constrain us so we become static rather than dynamic. We're overcome by the inertia, limitation, and self-deception. The investigation of things from Zhu Xi's point of view is defined as our ability to probe or to appreciate the principle inherent in everything, especially the principle that is inherent in us, which means our human nature. Therefore, the quest for the principle inherent in things is very much a quest for understanding of the principle which is a mirror reflection of our own nature. So any form of study trying to search for the principles inherent in things is a form of self-knowledge. Self-knowledge laden with very profound ethical, religious implications. I just want to use maybe one example, maybe elaborate a little bit to understand this. Let's take the example simply of the art of reading. The art of reading, reading a text, reading a classic, as a way of probing the principle inherent in the text. Just take one example. Let's say reading The Great Learning, a Confucian classic, as a way of probing the principle. Now, a classic, by definition, is an authoritative text. A text over the years, with all the commentaries, the text has been enriched by the commentaries, as if the text is not something that written, static, closed, and therefore frozen in history. The text is open, is dynamic, and even transformative, because the text, through various kinds of interpretations, has assumed all kinds of ideas or even cumulative wisdom. So when we confront the text, we confront not with dead letters, we confront with the living reality. Normally, we have to overcome, for you in particular, we have to overcome major difficulties looking at a text of this nature. First of all, it's transtemporal. The text was written more than 1,000 years ago, even though it was interpreted, translated, and it was a text. You have to say, you have to go beyond, you have to overcome some kind of transtemporal, you have to be able to do it in a transtemporal sense. You have to overcome the time. Otherwise, it's radical otherness out there. And since it's translated, you really have to overcome the difficulty of being a different culture. So what you do is not only transtemporal, but also cross-cultural. And many of you are not at all involved in East Asian studies. Maybe this is your first exposure to anything in Chinese studies or East Asian studies. So this is also interdisciplinary. You may be in computer science, you may be in biology, many other areas, but this is something very new, very different. So in order to engage yourself in a text like The Great Learning, you need to overcome the time, the space, and of course your own discipline. So you have to overcome quite a number of different mental structures to be able to confront the text. Let's use one example. I think that may be of some help. If we watch a play, and we first watch a play and it's on stage from a distance and allowing the play to present itself. We may do that throughout the play, and the play is going on, and our own mental resources are not at all affected. But if we really want to see a play, we need to enter into it. We may try to identify ourselves with some of the actors or with the scene, with a special kind of situation. So we enter into the play. Now, the only way we can enter into the play is that we suspend many of the mental structures that we assume to be correct. If we want to question it, it's so time-wise, it's so distant, and it's so alien in terms of cultural assumptions, we'll never be able to enter into it. So the second stage is that we may be able to enter into the play by forgetting many of the mental structures that we take for granted. And that's not enough. The third stage is that we be able to perceive the world from the perspective of the play itself. Almost the world is a stage, right? You go into the play, you try to understand it internally, but at the same time, you assume a perspective, which is the intelligence of that play, and looking at the world from that perspective. Now, on the surface, this is difficult, but this is an important test for our ability to understand something, which on the surface is radically different. Some anthropologists have used the expression, it's a liberating experience if we can confront intelligently something which on the surface is radically different. But the final situation is you cannot stay there. You cannot just assume the intelligence of the play and looking at the world. You have to come back. Now, when you come back, your worldview, hopefully, has been enriched by your encounter, your experience of the play. So you have a much broader view of not only yourself, but also of the world. Now, let's use that and try to look at the text of The Great Learning as an example. This is, of course, implicit in Zhu Xi's art of reading. It's also a method of learning. The method of learning is to open ourselves up to all kinds of possibilities. Normally, we do not consider even relevant to us, to open up to possibilities. But open up to these possibilities does not mean that we simply our mind become extended, become broadened, so we'll be able to acquire all kinds of knowledge. That's not the image at all. The assumption is that if you encounter one thing with all your energy, with all your inner mental attentiveness, you may be able to acquire much more than simply horizontally extend your heart and mind. Now we know in educational philosophy, if you have to learn a foreign language, to learn one very, very well is much better than learn 5 poorly. Learn one language very well. If you have to learn musical instruments, acquire the knowledge of one very, very well, it's much better than you can play many, many instruments poorly. So this idea of concentration, the effort to extend your heart and mind, is predicated on the belief that if you encounter the things as manifested in many different kinds of modalities, your appreciation of the principle inherent in you will be greatly enhanced. So in this sense, when you are confronted with a text like the Great Learning, or like a play, you do not simply look at the text as something that can be easily digested. You allow the strangeness of the text to persist in the sense that you don't domesticate it prematurely. This, of course, is predicated on your commitment to the reading, not simply as a mode of comprehension, cognitive comprehension, intellectually trying to comprehend, but also as a form of action. To know, in this sense, implies a transformative act. Let's assume the play. We observe a play, we are affected by the play. The observation of that play, entering into the play and try to look at the world from the perspective of the play, and eventually our own understanding of the world is enriched by that particular experience, which means that our self-knowledge itself has been transformed. So it is not simply acquiring some kind of new knowledge. It is also a challenge to our own perception of how the world actually functions. If we do this, then the important thing is to see the linkage between the internal and the external. First of all, the question is, can we really listen to the voice of the author or the authors who actually were instrumental in the creation of a text? Or we cannot truly appreciate what the inner voice is. Is there any kind of sympathetic resonance when we read a text? Is there any kind of sympathetic resonance? If not, for example, when you read it, it becomes totally mundane and you're not being inspired or affected by it. If not, then the psychology, from Zhu Xi's point of view, give it the benefit of the doubt. Because you have to assume the intelligence of the text, the authoritative nature of the text. You give it the benefit of the doubt. If, however, you find tremendous internal resonance, as if it speaks your own heart and mind, but do not tie up loose ends prematurely. If you feel that it's very easy for you to get into a text, from Zhu Xi's point of view, it's very dangerous, because immediately you're going to domesticate it, you're going to make it very familiar. In so doing, you probably only enhance your bias, your own prejudice, because you haven't really learned. So even if you feel that you can get into it very quickly, allow the process to be a little bit slower. But the critical spirit, this is extremely important, the critical spirit has to be preserved. Now, we can even say in the Confucian style of moral reasoning, there is no dogma which cannot be examined. Any of the statements, any of the intellectuals we talked about, Confucius, Mencius, Xunzi, Zhu Xi, and so forth, any statement made is subject to verification. And that verification is based upon the critical spirit of the reader. All assumptions are open to question. The reader has to exercise the critical faculty to do it. Otherwise, you don't get it. You have the classical statement, if the person is not stimulated, is not inspired, the instructor has no way of conveying any idea. So learning in this sense has to be proactive. Learning is not passive process of internalizing the precepts, the ideas that already conceived by others. So to go into this text with the psychology of suspicion, with a sense of doubt, and yet the spirit of reverence that we talked about earlier, the spirit of reverence and the spirit of seriousness, of respect, will have to be there as well. Why reverence? Reverence is the assumption that the intelligence in the text itself is to be discovered, rather than the assumption that the text, there may be some kind of sinister force in the text that cultivate our misconception or our own self-deception. In other words, we have faith in the intelligibility, in the meaningfulness of that text. That's the reason why we want to take it absolutely seriously. It is in this sense, then, learning as an active involvement is predicated on the ability for us to discipline our heart and mind as a precondition for reading. In the classical situation, often, this is not only the Confucian tradition, but also in the Buddhist tradition, very serious reading requires the fasting of the heart and mind. The fasting often involves a ritual, like burning incense, sitting quietly, allow one's heart and mind to become totally tranquil, as a precondition for reading a text. The idea is that you are confronted with a sacred text. Your mental preparedness is required. Without that that kind of mental preparedness, you will not be able to enter into a text. So that involves continuous practices. So Zhu Xi's own experience is a continuous interaction between himself and a text. The text becomes, a friend. Almost you have to pay a visit every day. And the friend has tremendous inner resources that you can share. Now, I want to, maybe you can ask yourself, whether in terms of your own experience of reading, have you ever encountered a situation we call it totally refined reading? In other words, have you memorized the text? Any text? Have you read a text continuously? Have you encountered a text almost like, if not a daily ritual, as a ritual, or weekly or monthly ritual? For some of you, maybe in the Christian tradition, in the Judaic tradition, Islamic tradition, and so forth, you may have some of those sacred texts. You try to read, you try to digest, you try to understand. So you have that experience. But I think the majority of us do not have that experience whatsoever. We've never read a text or memorized it. Maybe for some of you, poetry. Memorize 2 or 3 lines or a few lines of poetry, or Shakespearean literature and so forth. Now, the reason for this is that if you allow yourself, I think you may want to find not necessarily the Confucian text, any text, the important authoritative text. Do the experiment for a month or so. If you allow yourself to be confronted with a text, an important text, maybe a short one, and read it time and time again, just continuously reading time and time again, or every day at least read it 3 or 4 times, you develop a different kind of relationship. And that different kind of relationship is not simply memorization at all. Normally, people believe that the Confucian tradition, Confucian education, encourages rote memorization. Before you understand the text, you just try to read it, and you do not know the meaning of it. You just try to digest it. And maybe I will end with an anecdote. A friend of mine, Paul Desjardins, who passed away, a great scholar of Western philosophy, but also very much fascinated by classical Confucian thought, when he taught at Haverford, small seminars on Confucian classics, he always used the Great Learning as the test. And he insisted all students who took the course, 15 or so normally in the seminar, memorized the first paragraph of the Great Learning in Chinese. Now, overwhelming majority of the students, maybe all of them, didn't know a word of Chinese, right? So he insisted, use transliteration, this group of students to come into the class to memorize the first paragraph. So they will all be able to say, 大学之道在明明德，在亲民，在止于至善。知止而后有定，定而后能静，静而后能安，安而后能虑，虑而后得。Very simple, one line. Everybody qualified to take the course will have to memorize that. So, of course, the students rebelled, some of them, that this is ridiculous. This is one of the worst kind of insult to our intelligence, and also imposing certain kind of alien structure upon our mind. But he insisted upon that, and I went to Harvard for a few times, and it's amazing that each class that he taught, with that kind of repetition, and of course, after a while, the students can understand the ancients who wish to illuminating virtue all under heaven, first govern their states. That's the meaning of that line. It's not simply those strange sounds and words. And that internalization is what some scholars call indwelling. That indwelling become even sometimes involuntary. But that involuntary process familiarize yourself with a certain kind of ancient, we know in the Tibetan tradition or in Hindu tradition, there are many, many texts that people do not have the understanding or full comprehension, but try to internalize these texts as a form of mental discipline. And that mental discipline, if we haven't had any knowledge of that, that kind of mental discipline becomes important for us to confront a major text of this nature.